Eddie Gill here from RANS Aircraft with another tech video. Today we would like to talk about building the trim tab on the S-21 Outbound. The trim tab is not a difficult surface to build if we take a few precautionary steps and follow a few tips and tricks that we have learned along the way. But building a straight trim tab starts with building a perfectly straight horizontal stab as well as a perfectly straight elevator. So we're going to be looking briefly at those two items in preparation for the actual trim tab. Obviously we want to have as straight a surface as possible, but it looks great when the very trailing edge of that trim tab lines up perfectly with the trailing edge of your elevator as well. So let's start with the horizontal stab first. Because of the shape of the horizontal stab, which is fully symmetrical, it is very difficult to support properly, making sure that it stays in alignment. It kind of wants to rock on the table, especially if you have clecos on it. So the solution to the horizontal is supporting it on both ends by a couple of blocks. Now in particular, these blocks that I have here, or these angles I should say, are 3 inches in height, which allows space for the clecos on the bottom side, and I have these set up on both sides. Now, as I've mentioned in my rudder builds, it's very important to make sure that these surfaces are perfectly parallel to each other. So what we do is we set up a straight edge across them. We take a measurement. We bring that same straight edge to the other side. We take a dimension, and then we make sure that it's perfectly parallel. If we need to shim, we can choose which of the angles to put something underneath. It could be a shim of aluminum, 16th, 20 thousandths. It could be a playing card if you need. But just make sure that those two surfaces are perfectly parallel to each other. Now, placement of those angles is very critical. The spacing is very important. So you can see that I have them right under the spar on both leading edge and trailing edge spars. This will allow, when we have one side riveted, one side of the skin riveted, it will allow the rivets to just lie underneath the spars, between the angle and the spar, and it will space both sides up evenly, of course, and we still have an even plane on which to assemble this. So honestly, this is the only tip that you need to build a straight horizontal. Once you have the skin clecoed in place, I didn't cleco it now because I wanted it to show for clarity underneath. When we cleco this to the trailing edge, well, we'll have clearance for our very first cleco will be this one right here, or on top it would be this one right here. We won't use a cleco in this hole, we'll just start clecoing from here on, and that will allow clearance for the angles. You might use a lead bag or something just on each corner if you want to make sure that the horizontal is contacting the aluminum angles properly, but this ensures that it's going to come out perfectly straight. So we'll get on with the skinning, and we don't need to see that in this video. The next thing that we'll talk about will be the elevator. Okay, we are back, and I have made quite a bit of progress on the elevator assembly. I have gotten it up to the stage in which I need the trim tab, so I'll talk to you a little bit about what I've done prep-wise. We have used our aluminum building blocks. We've leveled them perfectly, and we've assembled the framework and riveted the top skin on the elevator. The location of those blocks is somewhat critical, and starting with these, you can see that I have the block kind of centered where the trim tab will meet the elevator trailing edge. We'll use that for support to position the trim tab fore and aft and up and down. I've got a couple of the blocks towards the center which will help support the trim tab as well. So everything is straight up to now, but I do need to have the trim tab. So the next segment that we'll take a look at will be the trim tab. Alright, so for the trim tab, I have assembled the ribs to the leading edge spar,
and I have clamped it to a straight table upside down. And the reason for this is that the holes that are pre-located for you in the spar and in the skin are on the bottom surface of the trim tab. So we're going to start with that side. I use an aluminum angle, and I clamp it in several places along the length of the trim tab. Knowing that my table is straight, I pull the rivets that I can access. There's a couple here you can see I can't access yet, but the rivets are already in place. I have a couple more to go into the ribs, but this is the first step that we need to do. Next is to finish putting in those rivets that are missing, and we're going to flip it right side up and clamp it to the table again and drill all the holes into the leading edge along the spar and into the ribs. Okay, well, now we have the trim tab drilled on the top side. We've sprinkled a few clecos here and there. It's still held down by the straight edge, but all we've done is just drilled it and put clecos in it. We are going to remove the straight edge. We can flip it around. We can deburr the holes that we just drilled, but it's going to remain clecoed on the top side for now. In fact, we're going to hinge it to the elevator, and only then are we going to commence riveting the top side. So it's pretty firm as it is. If we remove that straight edge, it does resist twisting, but it's not completely resistant to twisting yet. It can still be twisted, and just the amount of play between the clecos on the skin is sufficient to allow it to move back and forth. We're using that to our advantage when we're going to make sure that it's perfectly lined up with the trailing edges of the elevator. All right, so the next step is going to involve the hinges. So we need to make sure that we have cut our hinges into the 3 parts that are mentioned in the manual and have our pins in it, and we'll be using these for the very next step. Okay, well, we now have our trim tab in its approximate position supported on the blocks that are also supporting our elevator. And as we know, the hinges have no holes. We need to locate the holes. The holes in the hinges on one side are going to space the trim tab both fore and aft, and in the other, onto the face of the trailing edge spar on the elevator, they're going to hold it side to side. The very first thing we're going to do is establish the fore and aft dimension. Okay, we want to have the trim tab centered between the opening, and it's approximately 1/4 of an inch, but this is not the dimension that we're worried about right now. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to place the hinge in its location. And this is rather hard to explain. I apologize in advance if it's hard for me to explain this, but we want to take a visual note of, we've got our trailing edge here lined up in the back, right? We want to make a visual note of the pin that is sticking out of the hinge. If we were to view it in a vertical plane or completely perpendicular to the top side, which is the bottom, to the top side of that trim tab, we want to see the location of that pin in relationship to the leading edge of the trim tab. They usually come out about the same. I can see from here that about half the diameter of that pin is overlapped by the leading edge of the trim tab. Okay, so this is going to give us our location for fore and aft. Okay, about half of the thickness of that pin, and if I can see that that leading edge of that trim tab is lined up on the center line, the exact center line of that pin, I know that for this hinge it's going to be correct. So let's move the trim tab off onto the table, and I'll show you the next step. Okay, our trim tab is back on the table. We have our hinge. We're going to need to be able to center the hinge on those 6 holes. The easiest way, I'll hold it right over half the diameter of those holes and see that I have about equal amounts on either end, and then I'll mark the center line of just the 2 edge holes. That way when I have it underneath, it's easy to see those holes and see the line that I just drew. So now we are looking for locating our first hole. We know that a vertical view from this surface of the trim tab, we want to see half of the thickness of that pin. So this is where we can play with this dimension. We can move that back and forth. I can see that my lines are in the hole right there. I'm going to push it in just a little bit more. That looks to me like about half of the diameter of the pin. So I'm going to mark that hole. And there we have the first hole that we need to drill. So use a click punch, upsize from a number 40 to number 30. We need to start by locating this number 30 size hole. Okay, I've drilled my number 30 size hole and I have a cleco in it. I've flipped this pin around. I just removed it and stuck it in from the other side. We want to locate the other side of the hole. By the same token, we're going to look a vertical view straight down, want to see about half the thickness of that pin, and we're going to locate this hole. Okay? Let's drill that one. All right, I have finished drilling all of the holes in that hinge. So let's take it over to the elevator and see how it fits. All right, we've got it on the elevator and I think things are looking good. So now we have a nice solid stop. It can't go any further. And if this is held up tight against the elevator trailing edge spar to which it's going to attach, you can see that we've got the aft end of the elevator trailing edge and the trailing edge of the trim tab perfectly lined up. That's what we want. We're still going to worry about this in a future step. But for now, everything that we just did for this hinge, we need to do to the opposite side the exact same way, and then we're going to do the center hinge in the exact same way, and we'll come back. Okay, we've got the trim tab back onto the elevator, and this time we are going to be very careful with centering the trim tab between the opening. I've already measured and know that my trim tab is centered between the openings. So there are holes pre-located along the trailing edge of the elevator for attaching the hinge. There are no holes on the elevator on the trim tab hinge itself. So we're going to mark that from the inside. I have kind of like a little wooden wedge that I've made to hold pressure on the hinge up against the spar. And a very important step is I like to use my hand underneath and feel for the surface of the elevator top and the top of the trim tab to be more or less flush. So that can mean moving it up and down just a fraction. So we're going to move it up just a hair. I can feel that it needs just a little bit up to be flush with the top surface. And then I'll reach around. We'll mark the location of our first hole for that hinge. You could remove the whole trim tab if you wanted to. What I like to do, I find it easier to just remove the pin. And then I'll just remove that part of the hinge. You can see that I've got my first hole located there. So I'm going to go ahead and drill that and pin it back together and cleco it, and I can verify that the height and that it didn't shift side to side, that all the dimensions are correct. Okay, we have drilled our first hole, clecoed it back in place. The top surface seems to be level, and we did not lose our dimension that we have side to side. It's centered. So what we'll do is we'll mark the rest of the holes, remove the hinge, drill them, reinstall them, and do the same with the other two hinges, the middle hinge and the opposite side, and we'll come back and show the finished product. Okay, we've got the trim tab installed final. The gaps are nice, the height is perfect, it moves freely. So the next thing you need to do is remove the hinge pins and we're going to leave the hinges clecoed to the trim tab. Okay. Put your trim tab aside with the hinges installed. We're not going to rivet anything else. Set it aside and we are done with it. We want to come back now, and you can rivet this part of the hinges to the trailing edge of your elevator. And we're going to continue finalizing the assembly of the elevator. We'll install the bottom skins. We'll rivet it all together, and then we'll come back for the final step. And by the way, I'd like to give special thanks to my cameraman, Billy Bob. Hello! Okay, we are back with one of the very last steps on this trim tab. So we have installed the skins on both sides of the elevator. Everything is riveted. We're happy that the elevator is perfectly straight. And the trim tab where we left off last time, we had only clecoed the top skin and ribs to it and left it that way. So I have now put the pins back in place that hold the 3 hinges, and I've clamped one side. I hope this camera focuses well enough. I've got it clamped perfectly straight here, so that on the other side you can see that if need be for a little bit of tweak, this one came out really straight, but if need be, with the clecos on the top side, you could still play around with this edge and maybe fine tune it if you needed to. So what we're going to do, we want it to match perfectly. We're going to put 3 or 4 rivets in the open holes that we have along the top here, and then we're going to check it. And then we're going to come back and do another 3 or 4 rivets, come back and check it. There's going to come a moment when it's going to be completely rigid and you won't be able to move it, but check it periodically as you're putting your rivets in, and look for the edge on this side to be perfectly matching the trailing edge of the elevator. Okay, we'll put in a few rivets now. Okay, we have put every rivet in the trim tab, and we're very happy with how it came out. We already had shown that it's perfectly level on this side, which is the right side, and it stayed perfectly true here on the left side. It's perfectly centered. Remember to support the trim tab from below with your hand as you're putting the rivets in, so you don't put excess pressure on it. And this should yield you a very, very accurate and straight trim tab. As a bonus for this video, we're going to talk a little bit and show you a technique I use for the balance arms. So let me attach the elevator to the horizontal stab, and I'll be right back with that tip. Okay, so we have attached the elevator to the horizontal with a couple of bolts through the hinges. And I have attached the end rib for the elevator, which is the inner portion of the balance arm. The rib has quite a few holes, and you're still going to have to drill a few holes yourself into the end rib. And if you notice, I have used a couple of sandbags on the trailing edge, and I've played around with the sandbags, the depth. What I'm looking for is to get the forward part of the balance arm as perfectly straight as possible with the thickness of your horizontal. So this one is perfectly centered. And if we go to the right side of the horizontal, we can see that we have 0 twist. It is perfectly centered between the two. Now, if that were not the case for whatever reason, this is the tip that I wanted to give you, is that you can and should drill and attach the rivets while it's in this configuration, so you can go back and forth between both sides and tweak it as necessary. I mean, you will never have more than possibly a 1/16 of an inch, or maybe an 1/8 of an inch. If you do, then you have other issues, but you still have this recourse of being able to play with the location of the end rib as you're riveting it to it and make sure that it's perfectly straight. Now, one more thing that I like to do, once I have that end rib attached firmly with rivets, I will attach the rest of the pieces, the outer rib, the upper and lower balance arm skins, and I will rivet it all together while it's in this position, and I'm checking back and forth between left side, right side as I'm riveting to make sure that it always stays perfectly straight with the horizontal. And that is the tip that we wanted to give you before finalizing this video. I hope that this has helped you guys, and stay tuned for more good videos to come.